The morning was unusually still at Arlington National Cemetery. A low fog hugged the ground like a heavy memory, refusing to lift. Dew clung to the blades of grass like unshed tears, and rows of white headstones stood at attention, silent, unchanging witnesses to sacrifice. It was a day of honor, a day for farewells, but for one man it was something more, something unfinished. A small crowd of officials gathered under the archway, most in uniform, others in black suits bearing medals on their lapels. Beyond the gates, cameras clicked, shoulders stiffened, and the air carried the hush of military precision. A four-star general was being laid to rest, and nothing would be allowed to go wrong. Security teams had rehearsed it for weeks. Names were vetted, IDs double-checked. There would be no room for mistakes at the far end of the gravel path, unnoticed. By most and acknowledged by none, an elderly man approached. His coat was wool, dark and threadbare at the cuffs. His posture was proud, but stooped with time. He moved slowly, not from indecision, but because his body had long stopped matching the tempo of his will. In his right hand he held a faded service cap, olive green, fraying at the brim, and in his left a single white carnation. Wrapped gently in ribbon, the soldier at the checkpoint barely looked up. "This area is restricted, sir. Military. Funeral, four-star general. No clearance, no entry." The old man didn't argue. He just nodded once, as if he had expected it. His gaze moved past the guard, through the iron gates, to the ceremonial canopy rising in the distance. He didn't ask to be let through. He had made peace with such moments long ago. Still, something in his eyes lingered, not desperation, not even hope, but remembrance. He stepped aside and stood quietly near a low stone wall. The carnation trembled slightly in his hand. No one asked his name. No one asked why he had come. Inside the grounds, flags flanked the ceremonial pathway, their fabric fluttering like breath held too long. Brass shone on lapels, rows of polished shoes reflected the solemn dignity of state. A choir of bagpipes began to play in the distance, low and mournful, like a farewell whispered into fog dot at the front. Beneath the high canopy stood General Aaron W. Merrick's casket. He had been a legend commander of Allied forces during Operation Iron Spire, a tactician whose name adorned textbooks and war colleges. His eulogies would be spoken by senators and secretaries. But none of them had known him the way the man at the gate had, because before he was General Merrick, before the ribbons and the brass, before the parades and the flags, he had been Lieutenant Merrick. And there was one man still alive who remembered that version of him, the man who stood outside the gate, unseen, unacknowledged, the man who had once dragged a bleeding Merrick through 300 yards of hellfire in the jungles of Cambodia without asking for a single thank you. His name was Walter Emerson, and no one on the guest list knew who he was. Lieutenant Colonel Denna Morris, aide to General Merrick during his final campaign, happened to glance up from her clipboard as she approached the perimeter. Her eyes caught something, a patch on the shoulder of a forgotten jacket, faded but unmistakable. The emblem of Task Force Red Wing, a deep-cover reconnaissance unit, disbanded decades ago. She blinked. That patch was ghost history. No one wore it anymore. No one except the men who had vanished into records sealed by time. She walked briskly back toward the command tent and located General Merrick's son, himself a decorated officer. "Captain Merrick," she said quietly, "there's someone." At the gate, he barely looked up. "We have a list." She nodded. "Yes, sir, but I think you'll want to make an exception." Moments later, murmurs passed down the inner circle. A name was spoken first in doubt, then in awe. Walter Emerson, the man General Merrick had once written about in a private memoir. The man credited, though never officially, with saving the general's life on a night that changed the course of an entire campaign. General Thomas Alcott, now retired but still sharp in full dress, stood near the canopy. He heard the name, froze, and turned. His eyes swept the edge of the cemetery until they landed on the quiet figure by the gate. "Is that?" he asked. No one in particular. No one answered. They didn't need to. General Alcott handed off his ceremonial saber, straightened his coat, and began to walk past the chairs, past the flags, past the stares of high-ranking dignitaries who hadn't moved in years without cameras or scripts. He walked with purpose, with history in his chest. The crowd watched in silence as the general crossed the grass toward the gate. Time seemed to slow. Walter Emerson saw him approaching but said nothing. Alcott stopped 3 feet away, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he raised his right hand and saluted. It was not the formal kind of salute reserved for rank. It was the rarest kind, a salute between equals. Between warriors, between the saved and the Savior. "Mr. Emerson," he said, voice firm but reverent, "we've been waiting for you." Walter blinked. "You don't have to." But Alcott raised a hand, stopping him. "Yes, we do." He turned slightly and gestured. An aide stepped forward, carrying a wooden urn, polished, dignified, heavy with meaning. "General Merrick's remains. He left instructions," Alcott said. "Only you could bring him to rest." Walter's hands trembled, not with weakness, but with memory. He took the urn slowly, reverently. For a moment, his eyes shimmered with something deeper than grief, something unspoken. Recognition behind them, the formal guard paused. Officers stood, one by one. Members of the assembled forces rose to their feet. Not for General Merrick, not for rank, but for a man they had never met, the one who had walked through fire without medals, without fanfare, and without leaving a name. As Walter Emerson stepped through the gates, everything stopped. Taps hadn't even played yet. The casket hadn't been lowered. And yet, in that single moment, the funeral once scripted to the second became something else entirely, something real, and that was just the beginning. The walk from the gate to the canopy wasn't long, but for Walter Emerson, each step stirred decades of memories like dust shaken from an old photo album. The crowd parted slowly, solemnly. Phones lowered, salutes rose. Even the press, sensing something sacred, held their shutters in reverent pause. He didn't walk like a man burdened with ceremony. He walked like a man carrying the weight of a life, not just the one in the urn, but his own. A life spent in silence, in shadows, in sacrifice unacknowledged. When Walter reached the center aisle, General Alcott stepped beside him, offering no words, just presence. Together they moved in time with the wind, now carrying the scent of old oak and distant rain. Chairs creaked as every uniformed guest rose in a silent show of honor. There was no announcement, no signal, just instinct. Every soldier in that field understood without needing to be told. Something extraordinary was happening. Walter approached the raised pedestal. The flag lay folded beside a row of medals to be awarded posthumously. Legion of Merit, Silver Star, Defense Distinguished, Service Medal, but the urn, until that moment, had not found its place. He placed it gently on the black-draped platform, then stepped back. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't glance at the generals. He looked up at the American flag above, then down to his hands. Then, to no one in particular, he said softly, "You're home now, Merrick." A moment passed. Then, the silence was broken by the soft crunch of gravel. From the far row, a man in a civilian coat stepped forward, slow, careful, then another, and another, until a half-circle of men stood opposite the officers. Their bodies worn but proud, each with something tucked beneath their coats, a piece of the past. Unit patches, photos, folded letters, maps yellowed by time. They were the forgotten, the ones who had served in units never mentioned in parades, the men who vanished from official stories but carried wounds and memories just as real. And they had come not for the generals, not for the press, but for Walter. Among them was Elijah Croft, a former radio man-turned-rancher in Idaho who hadn't spoken in public since 1989, and Staff Sergeant Miguel Vega, who had once pulled Walter from a collapsed jungle trench during Operation Quiet Dagger. None of them had seen each other in over 40 years. But today, giving the stage to the man who had saved a future general, a battalion, and, indirectly, generations of military legacy. No one asked Walter to speak. No one needed to, but he stepped up anyway, slowly, deliberately, and turned toward the crowd. "I'm not a man of words," he began, his voice rough like gravel, long untouched by use. "Never have been. And this ain't about me." He paused. The wind answered in his silence. "It's about a kid named Aaron Merrick. Back when he didn't know how to lace jungle boots right, when his voice cracked while giving orders, when his hands shook not from fear, but from wanting to do right by his men." He looked at the urn. "We all grow into different versions. Of ourselves, some get stars, some get stories told, others, they disappear. I wasn't supposed to be here today. Hell, I didn't even know if I'd be let in. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a promise. No applause followed, no whistles. Only silence, a silence that felt earned. Walter stepped back, nodding to the honor guard. Taps began, not a recording, but a lone bugler standing under the archway. The first notes wavered like breath, then carried strong across the field. As they echoed through the marble columns and sacred rows, no one moved. And then, just as the final note faded, a man rose from the family section, tall, sharp, mid-40s, his jawline firm, his eyes scanning Walter with something between awe and humility. It was Aaron Merrick Jr., the general's only son. He crossed the grass slowly and stood before Walter. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, with a voice full of gravity, he said, "Sir, I grew up hearing your name in bedtime stories, not fairy tales." "Lessons," Walter blinked. "He told you?" Aaron nodded. "Not often, not much, just enough. Enough to know that my father wouldn't have survived Cambodia without a man who never took credit." Walter's lips twitched. Just briefly into a half-dashed smile, Aaron continued. "He told me once that man gave me a second chance. So everything I did after that, every life I helped save, every soldier I trained, he gets a piece of that too." Walter lowered his head slightly. Humbled beyond words. "I know we can't repay you," Aaron said, "but you deserve to know you weren't forgotten." He stepped aside, revealing a folded document in a leather case. An official letter, presidential seal at the top. Walter took it gently, his fingers barely brushing the edge. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked at Aaron and said simply, "He was worth it." And then he turned away again, back toward the grave, back toward the past that had finally caught up with him in the best possible way. Later, after the flag was handed to Merrick's widow and the canopy began to be disassembled, Walter remained seated beneath a sycamore tree near the back of the cemetery. The other guests had begun to trickle out. SUVs pulled away in orderly fashion. Dignitaries nodded to one another, speaking in quiet tones of respect and awe. But no one interrupted Walter. Not out of courtesy, but reverence. General Alcott approached. Slowly, holding something wrapped in cloth, he unwrapped it as he knelt beside Walter. A worn field map, creased, stained, faded with time. "You left this in my pack in '72, Alcott said. "I kept it." Walter traced the edges with his finger. "Didn't think anyone remembered." "We did," Alcott replied. "Some things we don't write down, we carry them." He looked across the field, then back at Walter. "The young ones understand this." Walter's eyes followed his group of new recruits, perhaps 20 or so, stood in silence near the road, watching. Some had tears in their eyes. One saluted, even though he hadn't been trained to yet. "I think," Walter said slowly, "they're beginning to—" The sky above Arlington had shifted from gray to soft gold. Rays of sunlight pierced through the oaks and cast long shadows across the headstones, and for the first time in a long time, Walter Emerson, the ghost of a forgotten war, felt seen, not because he asked for it, but because, at last, someone remembered. It had been nearly a week since the funeral, but for Walter Emerson, time had taken on a strange quiet. He had returned to his small home just outside Fayetteville, a modest one-bedroom with a squeaky screen door and a front porch that creaked when the wind shifted right. On the wall above his mantel was nothing but a framed photo, no medals, no certificates, just a single grainy image of a group of young men crouching in mud, grinning like they had no idea what history they were surviving. The letter from the president still sat unopened on his table. Not because he didn't care, but because what mattered had already been said in silence on that grass. Between the salutes, between the looks from strangers who suddenly understood, it wasn't until a few days later that the call came. It was General Alcott again. "Walter," he said, "I want you to come back. Just for one more thing." Walter hesitated. "I already said goodbye, I know, but this isn't for Merrick, it's for you." Walter didn't reply right away. Then, with a voice as steady as his walk, he answered, one last time. They met him at the airport, with no cameras, no crowd, just two officers in dress blues and a quiet black car. The windows were tinted, the ride smooth. No one asked him questions. No one filled the silence. When they arrived at the destination, Walter stepped out and saw it, a construction site at the edge of the city. At least, that's what it looked like at first, but the sign gave it away. The Walter Emerson Veterans Center, opening fall 2025, a sanctuary for those who served in silence. His mouth didn't open, his eyes didn't blink. He just stood there, watching as young builders and planners moved around like they were assembling something sacred, a place for healing, for remembering. Alcott appeared beside him, not in uniform now, but in a weathered jacket. We wanted to give them somewhere to go, somewhere off the record, somewhere real. Walter still didn't speak. Alcott continued. Every war has its ghosts. This is where they can come home. Walter finally turned. Why me? Alcott looked at him carefully. Because you were never supposed to be remembered. And that's exactly why we must. They walked through the unfinished frame of what would become a garden, a quiet courtyard with stone benches, a koi pond, and a wall. Not a wall of glory, a wall of names that history forgot, each carved by hand. As they passed through the corridors, young veterans nodded at Walter. Some didn't know his story, not fully, but they knew what he represented. Not bravery in battle, but the burden of survival. The invisible medals men carried in their hearts. In the far corner, a staff sergeant approached early 30s, limping slightly. He extended a hand. Sir, my grandfather served with Task Force Red Wing, said a man named Emerson saved their whole unit once. I didn't know he meant you. Walter looked at the young man's face, the eyes, the worry lines, the way. He gripped his cane like it was a rifle. Your grandfather make it back. He did. Passed last year. Told me the only reason I ever had a dad was because of you. Walter blinked. What's your name, son? James. James Teller. Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. You tell your father his old man was one of the good ones. The young vet nodded, his throat tightening. It wasn't until that night, long after Walter returned to his hotel, that he opened the envelope from the president. It contained one line handwritten in ink below the formal script. Some heroes never make the headlines, but this country still remembers its promises, even the ones it forgot to write down. He folded the letter, slid it into the inner pocket of his coat, and stared out the window. The dedication ceremony came 3 months later. There were no commercials, no news choppers, just people, dozens of them, veterans in wheelchairs, widows with medals on chains, children who had never met the uncles whose names they now traced in bronze with their fingertips. General Alcott gave a short speech. The mayor said a few words, but it was the moment they unveiled the final plaque, the one placed under the largest oak tree in the courtyard, that the crowd grew still in honor of Walter. Emerson, who asked for nothing, gave everything, and proved that sometimes silence speaks the loudest. Walter stepped forward, not expecting to. He hadn't prepared anything. His knees ached, and the breeze was biting. But he stood, coat tight around his shoulders, and faced the crowd. I was never supposed to be here, he said. A soft laugh passed through the crowd, respectful and warm. I thought the best thing I could do after I came home was disappear. Make room for the younger ones. Let the war rest. He paused. But war doesn't rest. It follows you, and not all wounds bleed. Some just whisper. For years, he looked at the garden now behind him. This place. It won't fix the past, but it'll catch the ones still falling through the cracks. He nodded, then stepped back. No applause. Just silence, the kind that means something. That night, after the ceremony, Walter sat alone beneath the stars. The wind was cool. A lily, fresh this time, lay on his lap. A gift from a child who had run up to him earlier and said, My mom said you're a real hero. I just wanted to say thank you. He hadn't known what to say then, but now, alone, he whispered it to the night. You're welcome. Across the courtyard, lights turned off one by one, but the wall of names glowed softly in the dark. And there, at the bottom, carved without fanfare, was one more line beneath the final row. And to those whose names we'll never know, we remember you too. Walter Emerson didn't live to see the 2nd anniversary of the center, but the staff still leave a chair out in the garden every Veterans Day, and every November, without fail, a single white carnation appears on that bench. No, one knows who brings it. But maybe that's the point. Because some stories never end. They echo. And in places like that, in the hearts of the forgotten, the healed, the remembered, the quietest, heroes still walk, not in medals, not in parades, but in footsteps that leave no sound and no doubt. And that's where we leave you. Here at Hidden Sparks, where forgotten names shine quietly and no act of courage is ever truly lost.